There's a particular kind of patience that doesn't look like patience at all from the outside. It looks like calm, like steadiness, like a man who simply isn't the type to make a scene. I spent 4 months perfecting that look before anyone in my house understood what was actually happening underneath it. My name is Nathan, and I teach history at a public high school on the east side of Dayton, where I also coach the debate team, which is the closest thing I have to a second job that doesn't pay enough to justify the hours it eats. I'm 39. My wife, Hannah, is 35, and we've been married 13 years by the time any of this started, with 2 kids, Caleb, 11, deep into his first real season of competitive baseball, and Lily, 7, who'd recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, a paleontologist, and an Olympic gymnast, all at once, depending on the day. Hannah worked as a regional sales manager for Callaway Medical, a mid-sized medical device company headquartered downtown, selling surgical monitoring equipment to hospital networks across 3 states. She'd started there 9 years earlier as an entry-level rep, taken 2 maternity leaves that, by her own account, had quietly cost her at least 1 promotion cycle each time, and clawed her way back into contention through a decade of long hours and good numbers. Her direct boss, the VP of sales, was a man named Adam, mid-40s, recently divorced, the kind of charismatic that made conference rooms a little brighter when he walked in, and a frequent fixture in Hannah's stories about work, the way any reasonably involved boss might be. I want to be honest about my own part in this story from the very beginning, because it matters more than I wanted it to. I was, by nature and by habit, the kind of husband who measured his worth in hours logged, grading essays until midnight, running debate practice 3 evenings a week, picking up a summer curriculum writing stipend 2 years earlier after a budget scare nearly cost me my position. I told myself I was protecting our family by working that hard. What I didn't fully reckon with, until much later, was how much of the actual day-to-day weight of our household, school pickups, Lily's bedtime negotiations, the slow erosion of Hannah's own sense of being seen as anything other than someone's mother and someone's employee, had quietly settled onto her shoulders while I told myself I was the one carrying the family. The evening I'd point to now, looking back, as the first thread pulling loose, came on a Tuesday in early spring, when Hannah walked in from a regional sales meeting glowing in a way I hadn't seen from her in longer than I wanted to admit. "Adam thinks I'm ready for the senior director role," she said, setting her bag down and pouring herself a glass of wine before she'd even taken her shoes off. "He's pushing it through ahead of the usual review cycle. Says I've earned it twice over, and he's not going to let HR's timeline get in the way of doing the right thing." "That's incredible," I said, and meant it, genuinely happy for her in that moment, because she had earned it, had been talking about that promotion track for 2 years with a hunger I recognized and respected. It was only later, washing dishes while she described the rest of the meeting, that I noticed the thin gold bracelet on her wrist, simple and clearly not costume jewelry, that I didn't recognize. "New?" I asked. "Team recognition thing," she said, turning the faucet off before I'd finished the sentence in a way that felt, in hindsight, like the conversation was already over before I'd asked the question. "Whole regional team got something for hitting quota. It's not a big deal." I believed her, mostly, the way you believe things you have no specific reason yet to doubt. I dried the last plate and put it away, and Hannah went upstairs to check on Lily's homework. And if you'd asked me that night whether anything was wrong in my marriage, I would have told you, honestly, that things were good, busy, stretched thin in the way every family with 2 working parents and 2 kids and activities is stretched thin, but good. What I didn't yet understand was that I'd already started noticing things and filing them away without examining them. The bracelet, the slightly too fast explanation, the way Adam's name had begun appearing in nearly every story Hannah told about her workday, not as an incidental detail but as something closer to a recurring character. I told myself none of it meant anything specific. I had essays to grade and a debate tournament in 3 weeks, and a son whose batting average I was, frankly, more actively tracking that spring than I was tracking my own wife's moods. That's the quiet failure at the center of everything that follows. Not a single dramatic blindness, but a slow, accumulating inattention, the kind that doesn't announce itself as neglect because it wears the costume of being a good provider, a present father, a man too busy doing the right things to notice the wrong ones happening just out of frame. I didn't know yet, standing in my kitchen with a dish towel in my hand, that the promotion Hannah was glowing about, and the bracelet she dismissed so quickly, and the man whose name kept threading through every story she told, were already, in ways I wouldn't fully understand for months, parts of the same unfolding thing. I only knew that something in the texture of that evening had shifted, slightly, in a direction I couldn't yet name, and then I had let it pass, the way I had let 100 small things pass that spring, because asking felt like a disruption I didn't have the bandwidth to manage. The weeks after that conversation folded back into the ordinary churn of a household running on 2 full schedules and 2 kids' worth of activities, and for a while I let myself believe the bracelet and the 2 quick explanation had been exactly what Hannah said they were. Caleb's baseball season was in full swing. 3 games a week plus practices, and between that and debate tournament prep, my evenings filled themselves without much room left for noticing anything beyond the next obligation on the calendar. Hannah's travel schedule picked up that same stretch. Quarterly regional support visits, she called them, 2 or 3 days at a time, sometimes alongside Adam, when a major hospital network needed executive-level reassurance during a contract renewal. It wasn't unusual for her role. She traveled like this for years, long before the promotion conversation, and I had no specific reason yet to read anything into the pattern. What I noticed, without quite letting myself weigh it properly, was how the texture of those evening phone debriefs had changed. Hannah had always called me from hotel rooms during work trips, usually quick and practical, flight times, a funny story from a client dinner, whether I'd remembered Lily's reading log. That spring, the calls started running longer, often after the kids were asleep, and more of them seemed to involve detailed accounts of conversations with Adam, his read on a client's hesitation, his strategy for the upcoming quarterly review, a joke he'd made that she retold with more warmth than the joke itself seemed to justify. I asked her once, half joking, if Adam was secretly running for Husband of the Year given how much airtime he was getting in our phone calls, and she laughed, a real laugh, and said something about how good bosses were rare, and she wasn't going to apologize for appreciating one after years of mediocre ones. It was a reasonable answer. I let it close the conversation, the way I let most things close that spring, because pressing further would have required a kind of attentiveness I'd quietly stopped budgeting for in my own marriage. My brother Eric, an accountant, came over one Saturday in April to help me sort through some tax documents before the filing deadline, and at one point, going through a stack of mixed financial paperwork, he held up a corporate expense summary that had apparently been forwarded to our shared family email account by mistake, a glitch in Callaway's system, addressing it to a personal account instead of Hannah's work one. "This yours?" he asked, scanning it. "There's a dinner here for $400 billed as client entertainment, but the location's a place I went on a date once. Pretty sure it's not exactly a hospital network kind of spot. Probably a real client dinner," I said. "She travels a lot for work." Eric shrugged and set it aside, and I didn't think much more about it that day, distracted by W-2 forms and a son who needed a ride to batting practice in 20 minutes. Looking back, that's one of the moments I keep returning to, a small, specific piece of evidence handed to me directly by someone with no reason to lie, and I let it pass because examining it would have required pausing a Saturday that was already too full, and because some part of me had already decided that asking questions about Hannah's work expenses felt like an overreach into territory that was, in some unspoken way, hers alone to manage. Priya, Hannah's closest friend at Callaway, came by for a barbecue in May, and I noticed, the way you notice something without fully registering its weight, how careful she was whenever Adam's name came up in conversation, not avoiding it exactly, but handling it the way you'd handle a glass you weren't sure was actually clean. When I asked her, lightly, if Adam was as good a boss as Hannah made him sound, Priya took a beat too long before saying, "He's definitely attentive," in a tone that didn't quite match the word. I let that pass too. I had a tournament that weekend and a stack of essays I hadn't started grading, and the particular shape of Priya's hesitation didn't register, in the moment, as something worth interrupting a barbecue to investigate. By June, the pattern had settled into something I'd half noticed and not yet named: Hannah's trips slightly more frequent, Adam's presence in our dinner conversations slightly more constant. A new energy in her that I told myself, gratefully, was just the confidence of a woman finally getting the recognition she'd worked 9 years for. I wanted that story to be true badly enough that I didn't examine it too closely, because the alternative required acknowledging a kind of attention I hadn't been paying to my own marriage, and admitting that spring, like a luxury I didn't have time for. The first moment that genuinely unsettled me, rather than just registering as background noise, came at the end of June, at one of Caleb's evening games. Sam, another baseball dad I knew casually from the bleachers, mentioned offhand, between innings, that he'd seen Hannah's car outside the Marriott downtown the previous Thursday night. "Girls' night, I figured," he said, not thinking much of it. "Saw it parked right out front around 9. Hannah had told me, that same Thursday, that she'd been working late at the office finishing a presentation deck. The Marriott downtown wasn't near the office. It wasn't near anything she had a regular reason to be, as far as I knew. I didn't say anything to Sam beyond a noncommittal nod, and I watched the rest of the game without really seeing it, replaying the sentence over and over, parked right out front around 9, feeling something settle into my chest that I recognized, distantly, as the beginning of a different kind of attention than I'd been paying all spring. Not suspicion exactly, not yet. Just the first crack in a surface I'd been content, until that moment, to leave unexamined. I didn't confront Hannah about the Marriott. I told myself I needed more than one second-hand comment from a baseball dad before raising something that serious, and that was true as far as it went. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that some part of me had already begun, without consciously deciding to, treating information differently, not as something to act on immediately, but as something to collect. I think that's the real beginning of what I eventually became over the following months. Not a man who confronted what he suspected, but a man who started quietly building a file in his head, and then, soon enough, on paper, while presenting to everyone around him exactly the same steady, unbothered version of himself he'd always been. Looking back, I recognize that instinct now as something closer to my father's temperament than I'd ever wanted to admit. He'd run his hardware store for 30 years on a quiet, watchful patience that occasionally tipped into something colder when he felt wronged, waiting for the precisely right moment to act rather than reacting in the heat of the thing. I used to think I'd inherited his calm. I didn't yet understand, that summer, how much of his capacity for delayed, deliberate action had come along with it. The first deliberate thing I did was simple. I asked Hannah, casually, over dinner in early July, more questions than usual about her week, which days she'd been at the office, which evenings she'd worked late, small details I filed away rather than acted on. The answers, compared against what I already half knew from Sam's comment and Eric's expense report glitch, didn't fully line up. Nothing was a smoking gun. Everything was just slightly, deniably off, the kind of small inconsistency you could explain individually but that, accumulated, started to form a pattern impossible to ignore. In mid-July, Adam's name came up again, this time in a context that struck me differently than before. Hannah mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd taken her out for what she called a strategy dinner, to talk through the senior director transition before the official announcement, just the two of them, at a restaurant across town from the office. "Just the two of you?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "It's not unusual, Nathan," she said, a flicker of defensiveness crossing her face that hadn't been there in our marriage, as far as I could remember, until recently. "He's mentoring me through this. That's literally his job." I let it go in the moment, the way I'd been letting things go all summer, but I noticed, with a kind of clinical detachment that surprised me, how quickly her defensiveness had arrived, faster and sharper than the question itself seemed to warrant. Priya called me directly in late July, on a Tuesday afternoon while Hannah was at a regional meeting, her voice tight in a way that told me, before she'd said anything substantial, that she'd finally decided to stop protecting a silence she'd been carrying for a while. "I'm not trying to start something," she said, "but there's talk at the office about Hannah's promotion, about how it's getting fast-tracked outside the normal process, and about how close she and Adam have gotten this year. I don't know exactly what's happening between them. I just know it doesn't look right, and I'd want someone to tell me if it were my husband." I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, the pieces from the last several months rearranging themselves into something with real shape for the first time. The bracelet, the Marriott, the strategy dinners, the expense report Eric had flagged in April, and now this, an unusually fast-track promotion, and office rumors substantial enough that Priya had finally felt compelled to break her own discomfort to tell me. I want to be honest about the decision I made in that moment, because it's the one that defines everything that came afterward. I didn't confront Hannah that night. I didn't even confront her that week. Instead, sitting at the kitchen table after the kids were asleep, I opened a blank document on my laptop and started, methodically, writing down dates, every business trip Hannah had taken that year, every detail I could recall about Adam's involvement, every small inconsistency I'd noticed and dismissed. I told myself I was being responsible, gathering facts before reacting irrationally. I understand now that I was also doing something else, choosing, deliberately, to delay confrontation in favor of control, building toward a moment I would orchestrate on my own terms rather than reacting to one I hadn't chosen. My brother Eric noticed the shift in me before Hannah did. He called in early August, after I'd mentioned offhand that I wanted to look more carefully at some expense records, and his voice carried real concern. "You're not acting like a guy who's worried his wife is having an affair," he said. "You're acting like a guy building a case. Those aren't the same thing, Nathan." "Maybe they need to be," I said, and I remember the silence that followed, Eric not quite agreeing, not quite arguing, just absorbing the particular coldness that had crept into my voice without my fully noticing it happen. By the end of August, I no longer doubted that something was happening between Hannah and Adam. What I hadn't yet confirmed was the full shape of it, whether it was purely personal, or whether, as Priya's comment about the fast-track promotion suggested, it had also bled into something closer to professional corruption, a betrayal that extended beyond our marriage into the fairness of an entire workplace. I decided, sitting alone in my classroom late one evening, grading essays I wasn't really reading, that I needed to know the full extent of both before I said a single word out loud. That decision, to know everything before I confronted anything, felt, at the time, like patience. Looking back, I recognize it now as the moment the marriage and the man I was inside it had already, quietly, begun to end, replaced by something colder and more deliberate that I wasn't sure, even then, I entirely trusted in myself. September became, in ways I didn't fully admit to myself at the time, a kind of second job, quieter than teaching, more consuming than coaching debate, conducted almost entirely in the gaps of an ordinary life that, to everyone around me, looked completely unchanged. I started with the financial trail Eric had accidentally surfaced back in April. using access I still had to our family's shared cloud storage, where Hannah occasionally backed up scanned receipts for tax purposes. I found a pattern of corporate card charges over the past 8 months that, cross-referenced against her stated work schedule, didn't hold together. Dinners billed as client entertainment on nights I knew, from baseball schedules and school calendars, that no client meetings had been on her itinerary. A hotel stay in Nashville in June that lasted 2 nights. Longer than the conference she'd told me about. A jewelry store charge in March that aligned, almost exactly, with the week she'd come home wearing the bracelet she'd called a team recognition gift. I photographed everything I found, dated it, organized it into folders on a personal drive Hannah had no access to. I told myself, each time I added something new, that I was simply documenting reality, not yet deciding what to do with it. I understand now how thin that distinction actually was. The professional piece of it came together more slowly, through careful, deliberate conversations I initiated without ever quite admitting their purpose. I reached out to a former colleague of mine whose wife worked in HR at a different division of Callaway Medical, framing it as harmless curiosity about how promotion review processes typically worked at the company. What she told me, relayed secondhand through my friend, confirmed what Priya had hinted at. Hannah's senior director promotion had bypassed the standard review committee entirely, approved through an executive override that Adam had personally pushed through, over at least 2 other candidates with longer tenure and comparable performance numbers. A move that had already generated quiet discomfort among other regional managers, who hadn't dared raise it formally. I want to pause here and admit something uncomfortable. Somewhere in the middle of that month, gathering this evidence with a calm, methodical focus that frightened me a little when I noticed it, I stopped being entirely sure whether I was building a case to understand the truth, or building a weapon I intended to use. There's a version of this story where a more honest man confronts his wife the moment he has reasonable suspicion, accepts the mess and uncertainty of an unplanned conversation, and lets the truth emerge messily, in real time. I chose something colder than that. I told myself it was strategy. I think, if I'm being fully honest, it was also something closer to control, a need to hold all the power in a confrontation I knew, instinctively, was coming, because some part of me had decided that if my marriage was going to end, I wasn't going to let it end on anyone else's terms but mine. Priya, by mid-September, had become an unwitting source of more detail, mostly because she trusted me and didn't yet realize how methodically I was using what she shared. Over coffee one afternoon, she mentioned, almost as an aside, that Hannah and Adam had been at the same downtown hotel for a regional leadership retreat the previous week, a retreat I had no record of on the calendar Hannah had shown me, which had listed a different city entirely. I drove past that hotel myself one evening that week, the same way, I realized later, a different husband in a different city might have driven past a different rental property, telling myself I had no specific plan, simply needing to see something with my own eyes. I didn't see Hannah's car. I saw something else instead, almost by accident. Adam, getting out of a cab in front of the entrance, glancing up at the building with the particular ease of someone who'd been there often enough that the place had stopped feeling like a destination and started feeling like a habit. By late September, I had what I considered a complete picture, months of financial inconsistencies, an improperly fast-tracked promotion, enough second-hand confirmation from Priya and my HR contact to know this wasn't simply a personal affair, but a workplace one with real consequences for fairness and ethics within the company, layered directly on top of a betrayal of our marriage. I made 2 decisions in the first week of October, both deliberate, both made without telling another living soul, including Eric, who I knew would try to talk me out of at least one of them. The first was to confront Hannah directly, on my own terms, once I'd finished compiling everything. The second, made with a coldness I still find difficult to fully explain even now, was to submit a detailed, source complaint to Callaway's corporate ethics hotline about the promotion irregularities, timed deliberately to land just before the company's quarterly business review, the same review where Hannah and Adam were scheduled to present jointly, in front of the full executive team, as a showcase of regional sales performance. I didn't do this purely out of malice, though I won't pretend malice wasn't part of it. I told myself, and still partly believe, that the promotion process genuinely deserved scrutiny regardless of my marriage, that other people had been passed over unfairly, that the company had a real interest in knowing what had happened. But I also knew, with total clarity, exactly what the timing would do, and I chose it anyway, fully aware that I was using a professional mechanism to inflict a very personal consequence. That is the moment in this story where I'd ask anyone listening to pause and consider whether the man making the decision was still entirely the husband he'd started out as, or whether grief and humiliation had already begun reshaping him into something else, patient, controlled, and far more willing to weaponize fairness than he would have believed himself capable of 8 months earlier. Washing dishes, while his wife described a promotion he had no reason yet to doubt. I submitted the complaint on a Tuesday evening in mid-October, 3 days before Callaway's quarterly business review, and confronted Hannah the following Saturday, once the kids were at a sleepover and the house was empty enough that nothing would interrupt whatever happened next. I laid the folder on the kitchen table, the financial inconsistencies, the timeline, the promotion irregularities, all of it organized with the same methodical care I'd put into 8 months of essay grading, and I watched her face change as she understood, page by page, exactly how much I knew and exactly how long I'd known it without saying a word. "You've been collecting this," she said, her voice flat with something between disbelief and a kind of dawning fear. 4 months. "Since July, mostly," I said, and I kept my voice level, almost pleasant, the tone I used when explaining a difficult exam question to a confused student. "I remember the strategy dinner. The one that was just the two of you, because he was mentoring you. I remember exactly how you said that word." I let the silence sit there a moment before continuing. "Funny how much mentoring apparently happens at a Marriott." "Don't," she said. "I'm not raising my voice," I said, and it was true, and somehow that fact seemed to unsettle her more than shouting would have. "I'm just remembering things. The bracelet was a team recognition gift, you said. I checked the jewelry store charge against the team's quota numbers that month. Nobody else hit quota that quarter. Just you." I tilted my head slightly. "I assume Adam has very generous personal taste in team recognition." She sat down heavily, and for a moment I watched something in her composure begin to fracture, not collapse entirely, but crack along a clear seam. "I'll tell you everything," she said finally, her voice steadier than I expected, almost controlled in its own way. "But I need to do it my way. Not with you reading from a folder like I'm on trial. Let me actually explain it." I agreed, partly out of genuine curiosity, and partly because some part of me wanted to see what shape her explanation would take. What followed was careful, structured, clearly something she'd rehearsed in some form before this moment arrived, an account of feeling invisible for years after Lily's birth, passed over twice for promotions she'd earned, coming back to a job where Adam had been the first person in a long time to look at her and see someone capable rather than someone managing a leave of absence. She described the affair as something that had started slowly, almost accidentally, somewhere around the previous winter, and she said the word affair clearly, without flinching, which I credited her for even as I recognized how carefully edited the rest of her account seemed to be. What she didn't say, not once, in that entire careful explanation, was anything about the promotion process itself, no acknowledgement that it had been improperly fast-tracked, no admission that Adam's favoritism had cost other qualified people a fair shot. She framed the whole thing as a personal failing, an emotional affair that crossed lines it shouldn't have, and left the professional corruption entirely out of the story she was constructing, as if hoping I'd accept the smaller, more forgivable version of events and never noticed the larger one sitting just outside its edges. "There's something you're leaving out," I said when she finished. "The promotion wasn't just Adam being generous to someone he had feelings for. It skipped the review board. It passed over 2 people with more tenure. That's not romance, Hannah. That's fraud, and you knew about it because you signed the paperwork." Her composure, which had held through the personal confession, finally broke at that, not into tears, exactly, but into something tighter and more frightened. "What did you do?" she said, not quite a question. "I filed a complaint with corporate ethics on Tuesday," I said, and I let the words land exactly as flatly as they came out, watching her absorb them in real time. "Sourced, dated, documented. The quarterly review is Wednesday. I'd imagine there's already an internal team looking at the promotion file by now." The color drained out of her face in a way I hadn't seen before, not even in the moments right after I had laid the folder on the table, because in that instant I watched her understand that this wasn't only about our marriage anymore, and hadn't been, for days, while she'd had no idea the ground under her career had already started shifting without her. "You used me," she said, quieter now. "Not just confronted me. You set something in motion before I even knew you knew. I had 4 months to decide how I wanted this conversation to go," I said. "I decided I wasn't going to be the only one in this house who didn't see something coming." We sat in a silence after that which felt different from any silence in our 13 years of marriage. Not the comfortable kind, not even the angry kind, but the specific quiet of 2 people who'd both, in their own ways, spent months managing a truth they weren't ready to say out loud, and who now had to sit together in the wreckage of having finally said it, on terms neither of us had fully chosen. The internal investigation moved faster than I expected. By the following week, Hannah had been placed on administrative leave pending review, and 2 weeks after that, the company quietly rescinded the senior director promotion entirely, reopening the role to the standard committee process. Adam was terminated within the month, not solely over the affair, which the company had no formal policy against on its own, but over the documented conflict of interest in pushing through a direct report's promotion while involved with her personally, a clear violation that left the company little choice once it was on record. Hannah kept her original position, demoted in everything but title, working under a new manager who had no history with her beyond professional respect. I won't pretend I felt nothing watching that unfold. There was a grim satisfaction in it that I'm not proud of, sitting alongside a genuine, quieter grief for the version of her career she might have built honestly, on her own merit, if she hadn't let Adam's attention become a shortcut through years of legitimate frustration. Eric, when I finally told him the full scope of what I'd done, was quieter than I expected, weighing something before he spoke. "You got justice," he said. "I'm just not sure you got peace alongside it. Those aren't always the same thing, Nathan." I filed for divorce in November. Hannah didn't contest the broad strokes of the custody arrangement, and Caleb and Lily settled, with a particular resilience kids sometimes manage better than the adults around them, into a new rhythm of 2 houses and 2 sets of routines, baseball practice and gymnastics lessons carrying on regardless of what their parents had or hadn't survived together. Priya called a few times that winter, mostly checking in, carrying a guilt she didn't need to carry, since whatever she'd told me had only confirmed a picture I was already, by then, assembling on my own. Hannah showed up at the house in February, 3 months after everything had finished unraveling at work, asking if we could talk. She'd been in therapy, she said, processing not just the affair but the deeper hunger underneath it, the years of feeling unseen that had made Adam's attention feel, for a while, like the only proof she still existed as more than someone's wife and someone's mother. She said she understood now how much damage that hunger had let her justify, and she asked, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had laid out a folder of evidence months earlier, if there was any room left to try again. I thought about it longer than I expected to, not because I doubted my answer, but because some part of me wanted to be sure I wasn't refusing her out of something colder than clarity. Pride, maybe, or the satisfaction of having won a war I'd fought in total secrecy for months. "No," I said finally. "I think I'd always wonder which version of you I was talking to, the one who's actually changed, or the one who's just better now at managing what she shows me. And honestly, Hannah, I think I'd wonder the same thing about myself. I'm not sure I like who I became while I was building that folder. I don't want a marriage built on two people who got very good, this year, at hiding exactly what they were planning." She didn't argue. I think some part of her had expected that answer, and some part of her, looking at the man across the table who'd spent 4 months in total silence assembling her downfall with the same patient precision he once reserved for grading essays, understood that whatever door she'd hoped might still be open had, in fact, closed somewhere back in October, the moment I chose strategy over honesty, and never quite managed, since then, to fully forgive myself for it either. The months since have been quieter, and slower to feel like peace than I expected. Caleb's batting average climbed all spring, the kind of small, ordinary joy I find myself paying much closer attention to now. Lily still wants to be 3 different things when she grows up, and I no longer assume I have unlimited time to hear all the reasons why. I think often about the man I was in July, sitting at this same kitchen table opening a blank document instead of asking my wife a direct question, and I no longer know whether to call that man patient or simply afraid of an honest conversation in a different costume than the one I'd worn for years. I got the outcome I wanted, professionally and personally both. I'm still working out what it cost me to get it that way. The most painful detail in this whole story isn't the affair itself, and it isn't even the fast-track promotion that turned a private betrayal into a public scandal. It's the 4 months I spent saying nothing while methodically building a case against my own wife, mistaking that silence for strategy when it was really just a more sophisticated version of the same conflict avoidance I'd been practicing our entire marriage, dressed up this time as discipline instead of neglect. What this story exposes, underneath the specifics of Hannah and Adam and a hotel near a hospital network's headquarters, is how a workplace can quietly launder a personal betrayal into something that looks, on paper, like merit. Adam didn't simply have an affair with a direct report. He used the legitimate language of mentorship and advocacy to push through a promotion that skipped the safeguards meant to protect fairness for everyone else on that team. And Hannah, hungry enough for recognition after years of feeling overlooked, let herself believe the shortcut was simply what she'd always deserved. That's the harder truth in this story. Not that ambition made her vulnerable, but that genuine, legitimate frustration over being passed over became the exact opening a predatory dynamic needed to disguise itself as validation. My own transformation across those months deserves equal scrutiny. I told myself, repeatedly, that gathering evidence before confronting her was simply prudence. Looking back, I think it was something closer to a slow substitution of honesty for control, a choice made one small decision at a time, to value winning the eventual confrontation over actually having it sooner, messier, and more honestly. The cause and effect chain here runs in both directions. Her hunger for recognition opened the door to the affair, and my own hunger for control, once I suspected it, shaped the cold, calculated way I chose to walk through that door myself. I don't think there's a clean answer to the question of whether reporting the promotion irregularities was justice or revenge, and I've stopped trying to force the story into one or the other. Both were true at once. The company genuinely deserved to know its review process had been circumvented. I genuinely wanted Hannah to lose something that mattered to her as much as I had lost something that mattered to me. Pretending those motives were separable would be its own kind of self-deception, no different in kind from the ones Hannah and Adam built for themselves. What I'm left asking, more than anything, is whether a different version of that October, one where I confronted her the week I first felt unsettled, rather than the month I finished building an airtight case, might have led somewhere less devastating for everyone, including the parts of myself I'm still not sure I fully recognize. I don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure I ever will. What I do know is that patience and avoidance can look identical from the outside, and that the difference between them sometimes only becomes visible long after the moment to choose between them has already passed. What strikes me most now, looking back, is how rarely we ask why people stay quiet for as long as they do, not out of weakness usually, but out of a need to feel in control of something that's already slipping away. I spent 4 months silent, and I've come to believe that silence wasn't really about gathering proof. It was about refusing to be the person caught off guard one more time. I don't know if I'd make the same choice again. Some days, I think I'd confront her the first week I felt something was wrong, honestly and imperfectly, and let the truth arrive messy instead of engineered. Other days, I think the same wound that made her vulnerable to Adam's attention is the same wound that made me capable of that much patience and that much quiet calculation, and I'm not entirely sure either of us came out of this year as the people we thought we were going in.